For almost half a century, the entire world lived in the shadow of a war that could have wiped us all out. But this was a totally different kind of war. It was this massive, global struggle for power that pretty much defined the modern world. But get this, it was fought without a single direct battle between the two main superpowers. This is the story of the Cold War.
It sounds like a riddle, right? You've got the two most powerful nations on Earth, armed with enough firepower to literally destroy the planet over and over again, locked in this intense, bitter rivalry, and yet they never actually declare war on each other. So how does that even happen? Well, that's the strange paradox we're going to unpack. Yeah, this wasn't a war fought on front lines with soldiers in trenches. This was a war fought in the shadows, with spies in back alleys, with propaganda on the radio, with scientists in a mad dash to conquer space, and most tragically, with the lives of people in other countries who got caught right in the middle of it all.
So before we get to the missiles, the spies, and the walls, you have to understand that it all started with one single, powerful disagreement. At its very heart, the Cold War was a battle of ideas, a fight for what the future of humanity was going to look like.
So here they are, the two competing visions for the world. On one side, you have the United States championing capitalism, free markets, and individual liberty. And on the other, the Soviet Union, which was pushing for a collective future under communism. And this wasn't just some political squabble. Both sides saw the other as a genuine threat to their entire way of life. They were convinced that in the end, only one system could possibly survive.
But here's the thing you got to remember. Just before this massive rivalry, they were allies. They fought together to defeat fascism in World War II. So, what went wrong? How did that alliance fall apart so fast?
Well, fighting a common enemy like Nazi Germany can hide a lot of problems. But once the war was over, Europe was in absolute ruins, and this huge power vacuum opened up. All those deep fundamental differences between the US and USSR came rushing right back to the surface. The question wasn't, how do we win the war anymore? It was, who gets to decide what the peace looks like?
And then, in 1946, one phrase gave this new, tense reality a name that would stick forever. Winston Churchill, speaking in Missouri, of all places, declared that an Iron Curtain had fallen. And with those three words, he perfectly captured the grim new division of an entire continent.
Now, this Iron Curtain, it wasn't a real wall yet, not made of concrete and barbed wire. It was a barrier of ideology, of censorship, and of military threat. On one side, you had Western Europe, rebuilding with American help. On the other, Eastern Europe, falling under the complete control of the Soviet Union. Families, countries, a whole continent just split right down the middle.
And this new reality, it set the stage for decades of pure tension. We're talking about a period of super dangerous standoffs and really brutal wars, with these moments where the entire planet just held its breath, knowing that one tiny mistake could lead to total, absolute annihilation.
You can really see the conflict play out in a series of incredibly tense moments. It all kicked off in Berlin in '48, where the Soviets tried to starve West Berlin, and the Allies responded with a massive airlift that lasted for a whole year. Then the rivalry literally blasted into orbit with the space race. The Soviets struck first with Sputnik, which totally shocked the world, but the US fired back with the ultimate answer, putting a man on the moon. But right in the middle of all that was the moment the Cold War almost turned hot. See, lurking behind every single crisis was the terrifying new reality of nuclear weapons. Both sides had them, and this created a military strategy with a perfectly fitting acronym, MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. The logic was as simple as it was horrifying. If you launch your missiles, I'll launch mine, and we'll both be completely destroyed. It was peace, but a peace kept only by the threat of total terror.
In October of 1962, that whole theory of MAD was put to the test. And for 13 terrifying days, the world just stood still.
This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. American spy planes found out the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. What followed were 13 days of a tense naval blockade, secret negotiations, and just white-knuckle decision-making that brought us closer to all-out nuclear war than we have ever been, before or since. Thankfully, diplomacy won, but the world had stared right into the abyss. So to avoid that direct, world-ending confrontation, the superpowers found another way to fight. They used other countries as pawns in their global chess game. We call these the proxy wars.
In places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, American and Soviet weapons, money, and ideology fueled these awful civil wars that led to millions of deaths. Also, one side could gain a bit of an edge in their massive struggle for influence.
But this kind of global standoff, well, it couldn't go on forever. And by the 1980s, you could really start to see some deep cracks forming in the foundation of one of the superpowers.
The Soviet Union was basically crumbling from the inside out. Decades of trying to keep up with the US in an arms race that was just unbelievably expensive, plus a rigid, broken economy, it meant people were facing empty store shelves and a pretty bleak future. A new generation was growing up, and they were getting restless. They wanted the freedoms and the prosperity they were seeing in the West.
Then, a new Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and he knew things had to change. He introduced two massive reforms: Glasnost, which meant openness and allowed for more freedom of speech, and Perestroika, an attempt to restructure the failing economy. The irony is, he hoped these changes would save the Soviet system, but instead, they ended up unleashing forces that he just couldn't control.
And then came the moment. The one image that truly defined the end of the whole era. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most brutal physical symbol of that Iron Curtain, was torn down by the very people it was built to keep in. The pure joy of that moment just echoed around the globe. It was the beginning of the end. And just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself just ceased to exist.
So, the Cold War officially ended in 1991, but its shadow? It's long. And if you really want to understand the world we're all living in today, you have to understand the Cold War. I mean, its legacy is all around us. The big international alliances that still shape world politics, like NATO, a direct product of the Cold War. The thousands of nuclear weapons left over from the arms race, they still exist, and they're still a threat. Hey, even the tech in your pocket, GPS, the internet, a lot of that got its start because of that intense superpower competition. It left a permanent mark on our world.
And that kind of brings us to the final question to think about. That specific fight, the US versus the Soviet Union, yeah, that's history. But when you look at the world today, at the new alliances, the global tensions, it's worth asking, has that fundamental struggle between different ways of seeing the world, has that really gone away? Or has it just changed its name? Something to think about.